Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow.
I'm G.A. Sola. Hello. In this fourth part of this series discussing indoctrination, I will detail what is arguably the most effective means by which people keep themselves indoctrinated to a particular belief: exceptionalism. Exceptionalism being the perception or belief that a species, country, society, institution, movement, individual, or even a period of time is exceptional in some positive or superior way. But firstly, I wish to clarify what is meant by critical thinking, the lack thereof being the key aspects of the very state of indoctrination. Critical thinking is defined as the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. This is the definition I have been and am using throughout this series. I do not know if any other definition exists, but I find it necessary to clarify definitions due to the growing trend of redefining terms for different reasons, and the fact that people understand certain terms differently. The reason exceptionalism is so important in the indoctrination process is because there are numerous groups, religions, and movements in the world. The vast majority of these groups claim exclusivity of truth, policies, moral code, or way of living, etc. Exclusivity being that they are right and everyone else is at least partially or completely wrong. And so they believe themselves to be a chosen people, or a peculiar people, or people set apart for something greater, or people with the best ideas for everyone else on the planet, or the only truthful remnants of a larger group, or even a super race of people with a special purpose in this world. The list goes on. And so to differentiate themselves from the other similar groups, these groups all point out aspects of their beliefs or workings that are exceptional or extraordinary, or just simply different from the other groups. Now, so far this is natural and not really a problem. The problem, however, comes in two main ways. The first being that the claims that the groups are making about themselves that would make them exceptional are simply not true.
The fourth way that Christianity is unique from all other major world religions is we have a resurrected leader. Every single other religious leader has died and has stayed dead. But we have a leader, a founder, Jesus Christ, who, yes, indeed, did die on a Friday, but 3 days later, he resurrected himself, rose from the dead, and now he is ascended at the right hand of the Father. And we know that because the body of Jesus Christ was never found.
The second being the differences or the aspects that they consider to be exceptional are not exceptional in reality.
No other major world religious leader or founder, if you will, ever made a claim to say that they were God or equal to God.
It would be a big deal.
This not only occurs in ideologies or religions, but even when businesses and politicians compete with each other and make claims to show exceptional aspects of themselves or their policies that are either not true or not exceptional, as in not anything special. Some common examples that different groups have used to show exceptionalism are that they have many or the most followers, and so they must be right, while contrariwise, the smaller groups will claim that they are right because they have few followers. The thinking behind that is that the smaller groups have received a special revelation or a hidden knowledge of sorts, one that the larger groups do not know of. Other groups will claim to be exceptional because they are stricter and more conservative to the fundamental beliefs of the group, while others will claim to be exceptional because they are more liberal and adaptable to the times, even when it means compromising their fundamental beliefs to an extent. The list really goes on, but for the purposes of this particular topic, I will discuss a very interesting and popular claim of exceptionalism, the persecution complex. But before I do, there is an important thing to note here.
My question is, does the evidence show that Jesus was a human being that came to earth, predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead? That's my question. And if he did, then it seems to me whatever he teaches is true. And if he taught that the Hebrew Old Testament was true, I'm accepting what he says on his authority.
Even if something is truly exceptional about a group, it does not at all imply that the claims or beliefs or policies are necessarily true as well. Neither does it necessarily mean that they're not true. For example, among Joseph Smith's many prophecies, he did successfully predict that the North and South would engage in civil war in America, beginning in South Carolina, and that the South would call on Britain for assistance. This is acknowledged by both believers and many skeptics as a fulfilled prediction, regardless of whether it was divinely inspired or perhaps an educated foreboding. However, does this mean that we are also to accept the other things that Smith claimed and taught, such as black or African skin being the result of the curse of Ham, or claims of the angelic visitations, or the never-before-seen golden plates? And likewise, are we also to ignore the many prophecies that did not come true, such as somewhat claiming in 1835 that Jesus would return within 56 years? This cognitive dissonance, by the way, is a tactic that psychics also use on their victims, customers. That is, when making bold claims or prophecies that they claim to be revealed to them by supernatural influence. If they make a single correct claim or prophecy, the believer will ignore all the other incorrect claims or prophecies and focus on the correct one. Usually because they began the process by already believing that the psychic was truly in league with higher forces. But in reality, even if they get them all wrong, some believers will still believe by interpreting what was said and moving goalposts. I discuss this in greater detail in the next part.
Why me, Lord?
In the 3 centuries that the Afrikaner has been in Africa, this image of the laager has changed, but it is still alive. For the laager is above all a state of mind which sees enemies everywhere and tries to protect against them.
Numerically, of course, the Afrikaner constitutes a very small group. And secondly, we feel as a group that we are being threatened by outside forces. We perceive the outside world, or we used to perceive the outside world, as being hostile in a sense to us.
Now, contrary to people who consider their prosperity and success as a sign that they are at least on the right track and at most the chosen people, the persecution complex is the exact opposite, whereby people consider their suffering, tribulation, and persecution from others, whether imaginary or real, as an indication of being a special group or a special individual. This sort of mentality is present in some shape or form among all manners of groups, such as political, religious, ideological, social, and as we will extensively explore in this video, cultural. It is typically used to garner sympathy from others and make the statement that no one's had it worse than us. Now, of course, one must be very careful with this form of exceptionalism, because the degrees to which people experience pleasure and suffering cannot always be objectively measured, because they are generally seen through biases. People use different criteria to answer the question of who's had it worse than whom. Some people place more emphasis on the intensity of the suffering, some on the duration, some on how many people were affected, and some on whether the suffering was justified or not. And of course, some on the type of suffering. This can quickly turn into a case of comparing apples and oranges, because, as much as many would be quick to answer, it will not always be objectively clear who suffers more than whom. Consider the hypothetical of a person who is tortured almost non-stop for 1 full month and a person who is tortured only for a limited time, once a day, with less intensity, but for a full year. There will firstly be a number of things to consider, but in the end, the fact is that they have both suffered from the torture, and even the persons who experience the torture personally will only be able to fully relate to their own experience, and not the others. As empathetic beings who can relate to each other, we can imagine what would be worse on a subjective level by imagining the scenario happening to us. But whichever answer one gives, another may give a completely different answer because what they consider worse suffering, another may consider not as bad according to the manner in which they experience suffering. And what of numbers? It is reported that over 6 million Jews were killed as an overall result of the Holocaust. If we are to compare that to the 10 million Congolese who were killed during the Congo Free State era, are we to say that the Congolese suffered more than the Jews because of the numbers? Or what of the 27 million Russians who died due to World War II? Now again, there are plenty of things to consider. But oftentimes a person may feel inclined to sympathize more with a group to which they relate to more closely. Now this is not at all to say that there is no objective means of measuring suffering, because there is, but it must be done by criteria, and the overall results will at least partially be subjective. Now returning to the persecution complex and how this relates to indoctrination. I'll use this example. In 2011, South Africa had a nationwide census. People, particularly organizations, were eager to see the statistics that would be concluded regarding different categories. One statistic that caused a particular controversy that persists till today in 2021 is the number of white South Africans living in poverty. The reported percentage was about 0.1% for whites. Subsequent studies showed that this was 0.9%, amounting to over 42,000 out of the 4 million whites in the country. This caused a number of both black and white South Africans to argue against the validity of this number, but for completely opposite reasons. Some blacks argued that the number was too big and believed that the number was actually less, mostly based on their day-to-day living, considering that the majority of whites still enjoy higher living standards than other races in the country. While the whites argued that the number was far too low and that there were far more whites living in poverty in the country who were not taken into account during the census. These whites who were arguing this, mostly Afrikaners, claimed that the census did not take into consideration the whites who were living in what they called white squatter camps being informal settlements. Now the problem was that no one actually had a good grasp of the true figures of white poverty, but AfriForum, for whatever reason and by whatever means, estimated that it would be around 400,000 compared to the government's 42,000. Conservative whites readily accepted this figure and in fact today frequently claim that this number has risen to 1 million. I must however stress that this statistic of 1 million is based solely on hearsay. No one has actually made an official count and reached that number. This number may have been erroneously reached by adding the number of white people who have left the country and considering them white people who are jobless in South Africa. Now here's the interesting part. In 2013, 2 years later, Black South Africans began to notice something interesting that anyone can test for themselves right this moment. When one types the words squatter camps in South Africa on Google, the overwhelming majority of images that will appear are of white South Africans and white children in rural areas, and very few black people, which is quite concerning considering that the reality is that the vast majority, and I'm talking millions, of people living in squatter camps are actually black. The vast majority of whites, however, live under higher salaries and in higher cost neighborhoods than any other race in South Africa, seconded very closely by Indians. South Africa is under a recession, and people of all races do lose their jobs. But the number of whites earning a low income or are considered impoverished is still a very small amount. And this is not in comparison to other races. This is in comparison to other whites who are earning middle class or upper class levels of income. So the obvious question is, how could this possibly occur? And there are two very clear and simple reasons but must be understood very carefully. During apartheid, the white population, who comprised mostly of Afrikaners, were vastly upper-class citizens in a country that privileged them to sometimes surprising degrees of wealth and opportunity to prosper. This fact is not disputed by anyone, not even the Afrikaners themselves. So when apartheid ended, one of the greatest fears for the conservative whites during the transitional period prior to the 1994 elections was that they would become marginalized under majority rule, considering that they are still a minority. But interestingly enough, though South Africa is indeed under majority rule currently, the economic situation for the majority of people of all races in the country has actually remained similar to before the transition of power. In other words, most whites are still rich and most blacks are still poor. Now, it's a small portion of middle-class conservative whites who are complaining the loudest regarding the issue of poverty among their own race because they live in fear of ending up like the seriously impoverished whites, and so they protest on their behalf, and usually in the hopes of reaching white conservative Americans. But here's what the world needs to know. In so doing, they also develop and spread a number of half-truths, exaggerations, misconceptions, conspiracy theories, and outright lies. And people around the world with a predisposition to believe them, usually white nationalists or simply people who do not fact-check these things, accept this narrative as facts even though they do not realize that the reality is far different. Of course, fact-checking these things can be very difficult when one does not live in the country to see the reality for themselves. Now, this is where the indoctrination comes into play, because they truly believe and even teach their children that there is an agenda to exterminate and genocide the Afrikaner race in South Africa completely. Most of the points and evidence they give to support the existence of this genocide, however, are occurrences that happen to people of every race and culture in South Africa, not just white people. Out of a strange case of exceptionalism, however, they believe that when these things happen to them and their culture, it is somehow more outrageous and more unacceptable than when it happens to other people of different cultures and races. Now, of course, do not misunderstand. South Africa is indeed a very dangerous country, and there are indeed people of other races who genuinely hate white people. It is also definitely true that it is black people who are attacking white farmers on farmlands. But as I've mentioned before, this is mostly due to labor disputes and land issues, in combination with racial tensions in the country. And so do not think that all black people are completely innocent either. However, the claims of an existing white genocide remain unproven. Of course, this is not the first or only occasion that the white genocide idea has been developed. White nationalists all around the world believe that there is an agenda to wipe them out or secretly replace them through means such as interracial breeding or annihilation. In brief, this idea stems from the psychology of being part of a race that one believes is superior to others. Such people tend to hold very controversial ideas about what they consider to be the natural order of things, such as white people being leaders and other races being followers, or wealth being a white people's thing and poverty being a black person's thing. So when a person of such a mentality sees their race losing their alleged superiority or wealth, or really just anything bad happening to them, paranoia kicks in and they begin to believe that other races are in cahoots to destroy them. There is no black poverty or white poverty, there's just poverty. even when they admittedly occur for different reasons. To believe that it's normal or more acceptable for people of one race to be poor, simply because that's been the condition for the majority of them for a very long time, or to believe that another race deserves to be poor because of crimes committed by people of the same race, and therefore somehow making them guilty by association, are all racist ideologies, and I use the word racist by the dictionary definition. And so, holding such an ideology of victimhood from the get-go, these conservative Afrikaners link anything and everything bad that happens to them to the idea that everyone is out to get them. To an extent, this mentality is indeed reinforced by the actions of other nations or cultures. For example, when the British dominated over the Boers, leading to the Anglo-Boer War, or when different countries raised sanctions against South Africa because of the apartheid regime, or affirmative action laws in favor of the previously disadvantaged, which obviously exclude white people, particularly white males. But many white conservative Afrikaners strangely extend this so-called persecution to other things that have absolutely nothing to do with them or nothing to do with their race in particular, once again placing themselves at the center of attention of things that happen to everyone of every race, such as the recent proposal to ban all guns in South Africa. Many Boers are considering this an attempt to disarm them specifically, even though this applies to everyone of every race in South Africa. Or the farm murders that are still happening even though they ignore the numbers of black people who are also killed on farms, sometimes at the hands of white people. But because farm murders are usually reported from the white perspective, outsiders understand it to be a problem against white people only.
Basesha imoto beforced ukuthi lapho baqalela khona ukuthi basishaye before basishaye nje baqale lapho ke basishaya ke sivasiwe umlungu akhona omunye wawazi wangibeka ispam mina la kahle nganga sekonshi ubhuti wami uyilapha ngibuza khona wabuza mina wathi awulimala ngasi akwabe kugcina lapho ukuthi sikhulumisana sasilungu nje bafika amaphoyisa avulele izivalo zemoto baba checka labo hayi bathola ukuthi ngathi babe ngasaphefumuli.
Now, to answer the matter about Google will publicize anything that they believe will generate more interest, because by generating more interest they generate more capital. And the conservative Afrikaners are increasingly reaching out to other countries, mostly America, and mostly during Trump's administration, to aid them by blowing things out of proportion and portraying themselves through a victim narrative. They will neglect to mention many facts, such as many people that they consider impoverished are actually middle-class citizens, or the fact that whites still on average earn many times more than their black counterparts. Instead, they will only show images of white children in dirty clothes playing in rural streets because that is what they want the world to see, because it is convenient for their cause and promotes their narrative. But also because to an extent that's what they actually believe and teach their children to believe, that they are victims and they need to fight back against the world. And to make matters worse, there's a number of individuals who are spreading and reinforcing this belief and fear among the South African white community.
The white community are being targeted now by the police. The black community are allowed to do what they like. The white community are targeted and arrested.
No, Linda, please.
And for those caught outside without a proper reason, some uncomfortable arm bracelets. Well, so far we've seen a handful of people arrested for flouting the lockdown regulations, including a woman for selling achar without a permit.
And the authorities say they're investigating. One of such is that of a man in Alexandra Township, north of Johannesburg, Collins Khoza. His family is in mourning.
Does this remind you of something that happened 80 years ago? I think so. What you have happening before your eyes is the early stages of a genocide against the white population in South Africa.
Many of these individuals are not even living in the country, and yet are very quick to suggest and incite radical action from the whites because they know that they will not physically partake in it themselves.
Well, I have
a tongue-in-cheek, just clearly a tongue-in-cheek suggestion on this issue. We know that the building where all the applications for firearm licenses are being held is just full of piles of paper. It's just full. The whole building is just full of these applications. Now, just like a few weeks ago, that library at UCT was burnt to the ground during that fire, wouldn't it be fortuitous if all those documents with everybody's address and their names and their license details suffered the same fate? Because then they would not be able to track where those guns are, those regular licensed guns are, because all that documentation would have disappeared. And when we talk about unlicensed guns, you'd have a situation where the honest gun owner would now be on a par, because he would not have to abide by this regulation where he has to hand in his gun. It seems like and I say it again, it's a tongue-in-cheek suggestion, but it would certainly get rid of the information that they would need to actually go and confiscate someone's gun, wouldn't it?
Such people spread false information because they obtain a very biased narrative. The same thing, by the way, also happens among black people living outside of South Africa. This can of course be avoided if people fact-check their sources and remove themselves from echo chambers by listening to other points of view. There is, however, a second side to this time regarding black South Africans. Although still widely in financial struggle, many middle-class black South Africans have developed a countering attitude to the victimhood mentality. The reality is that there is a number of black South Africans who have immensely enriched themselves since the country entered majority rule, and have set up a trend that's developed an attitude of a luxurious and high-class lifestyle. And it's not just because of the mentality of seeking out luxurious items. There appears to be a growing movement among Africanists of all sorts to show a brighter and more powerful side of Africa and African people. And so they prefer to downplay the more negative aspects of Africa, which unfortunately is still the majority of Africa, and rather highlight the more positive, wealthy side of it. Of course, whenever it's convenient, these same Africanists will also show the world a more victimized side of Africa. This is common among all groups and all nations, to show a certain narrative whenever it's convenient to promote whatever cause they're trying to promote. So ironically, many conservative Afrikaners are portraying themselves as poor when the majority of white people in South Africa are rich. And contrariwise, some black South Africans are portraying themselves as rich when the majority of black South Africans are poor. This is of course not lying when they are referring to their own situation, but it does paint a distorted picture to people of the outside when they do not obtain the facts about the entire situation for everyone in the country, and instead only hear one side or the other.
All the world has seen the beautiful Greek Acropolis from the front, but the world never knew what went on behind its back.
Now that was regarding the people sending out the information. What of the people receiving the information? Of all countries in the world, South Africans tend to be interested in the United States the most, and some blacks and whites tend to try to reach out to them to explain their side of the story. Now Americans themselves, because of their own climate and problems, tend to accept or reject this information for rather interesting reasons. Let's begin with the blacks. The American leftist position nowadays is usually more interested in hearing about the inequality that disfavors blacks in South Africa, because many of them can relate to it to their own struggles in the States, while the right-wing position tends to be more interested in how well blacks are doing in South Africa. But they do still admit that there is inequality between blacks and whites in terms of income in South Africa. When it comes to the white South African narrative, the same leftists tend to be more interested in how well whites are doing to emphasize the inequality in favor of whites, and sometimes to downplay, deny, or ignore poverty among whites almost entirely, while the same right-wing position tends to be more interested in how badly whites are doing to emphasize how mistreated whites are in the country, especially when one brings up affirmative action laws, collectively known as Black Economic Empowerment, or BEE. Indoctrination plays its part in keeping these predispositions alive. The facts don't particularly matter to extremist positions. All that matters is that the narrative suits their cause, and so they will emphasize or sometimes only accept ones that work in their favor, and downplay or sometimes outright ignore or deny ones that work against them.
The minority of white people in the country were ignored by means of food parcels given out by the government, by whoever gave the food parcels out. We had to smuggle milk during lockdown in curfew to feed our people. We had to smuggle food. Where white people were living in a squatter camp, they went and stand in line to get food. Where other people, black people from the same area in squatter camps came to get food. The white people were shifted one side and was not giving one iota of food. And if they did get food, the blacks would go into the house and take that food out. And we've got proof of that.
This sounds more like Nazi Germany.
It's worse. It's worse.
It's worse.
Africa became the biggest concentration camp for white people in the world today, and we are ignored because of BLM, which is the black flavor of the day.
Now, I should probably say a word on BEE to not cause any misunderstanding here. There are indeed laws that highly favor blacks and disfavor whites in South Africa. For example, for a university to be BEE compliant, they must accept only a certain percentage of white students and accept a certain percentage of students who qualify as previously disadvantaged. This includes blacks, coloreds, Indians, females, and the handicapped. Now, it is not law that a company or business must be BEE compliant to exist. But if they choose not to be BEE compliant, they do not qualify for certain things such as government aid, but they are free to take up loans through banks. However, some whites complain that the government occasionally tries to prevent white-owned BEE compliant companies from assisting non-BEE compliant companies that are white-owned. This is indeed a possibility, but has not been confirmed and has not been reported to be officially ordered by the ANC government. But I do stress that this is indeed a possibility, considering how incredibly corrupt the ANC government currently is. In conclusion, there are indeed things that can make a group or individual different or exceptional, in positive and negative ways. However, these claims or exceptions do not necessarily confirm the claims or beliefs of the group or individual in question. Indoctrination heavily relies on people believing that they are right, and when proof or evidence are not on their side, exceptional aspects or qualities about the belief or group become their strongest determining factor, other than what the group has to offer, which we will look into after the next part of this series. In the next part, however, we will consider how many people who consider themselves free thinkers or skeptics may be indoctrinating themselves into limiting what arguments can and cannot be considered seriously. We'll consider and discuss the indoctrination among conspiracy theorists, and how the term conspiracy theory has become a means of dispelling and humiliating any and all conjecture or hypothesis, sometimes because they sound so crazy on the surface that people adamantly refuse to even consider looking into the facts. We will therefore consider some past examples to see how this sort of attitude can be and has been a problem. I'm G.A. Sola. Goodbye.
You think you're in pain? I don't think you know what the word means.